Tonight, a story about a book, and about the small cold island where it was made. It is a true story. It is also a very slow one, which is why I have chosen it. There is nothing in it that will startle you and nothing you need to keep track of. You do not have to remember the names, or the dates, or which century we are in. If you fall asleep partway through, the monks will carry on without you, which is more or less what they did anyway. So settle in. Let your breathing slow down. We are going to a room with a window, a table, and a man doing one small thing very carefully. Lindisfarne is a tidal island. Twice a day the sea comes in and covers the causeway, and for a few hours the island is genuinely an island, cut off from Northumberland by a stretch of grey water and wet sand. Twice a day the sea goes out again and you can walk across. It is a low place. There are dunes, and rough grass, and not much shelter. The wind comes off the North Sea with nothing in the way to slow it down, and in winter it is cold in a particular flat, persistent way that gets into stone and stays there. A monastery was founded here in the year 635, by an Irish monk named Aidan, who had come from Iona. It grew. It became one of the most important religious houses in Britain. And at some point around the year 700, in a room on that island, somebody began work on a book that people would still be looking at 1300 years later. It is now called the Lindisfarne Gospels. It sits in the British Library, in a case, in dim light, opened to one page at a time. And it began here, on a rock in the sea, with a pile of animal skins. Before there was writing there had to be something to write on, and that meant vellum. Vellum is calfskin, prepared until it becomes a smooth, pale, flexible sheet. The process is long. The skins are soaked in a lime solution for days to loosen the hair. Then the hair is scraped away with a curved knife, and the skin is stretched on a wooden frame and scraped again, thinner and thinner, while it dries under tension. The scraping is the skilled part. Too little and the sheet is thick and greasy and will not take ink. Too much and you go straight through it and the whole skin is ruined. A good sheet comes off the frame smooth on one side, faintly velvety on the other, and if you hold it up you can sometimes see where the animal's veins ran. Scholars have estimated that the Lindisfarne Gospels required the skins of somewhere around 150 calves. That is not a small thing for a community on a small island. It represents an enormous investment of livestock, labor, and time before a single word was written. Somebody decided this book was worth that. And then the sheets were cut, folded, and gathered into stacks, and the real work began. We think we know who made it, though I want to be honest about how we know. In the 10th century, more than 200 years after the book was written, a priest named Aldred added a note at the end. He wrote that Eadfrith, Bishop of Lindisfarne, made the book, that Ethelwald bound it, that Bilfrith the anchorite made the metalwork for the cover. Aldred was writing long after the fact, so this is not an eyewitness account. It is a tradition that was already old when he recorded it. Most scholars accept it as broadly reliable, partly because the book shows every sign of being the work of one hand, start to finish, which fits the story of a single named man. Eadfrith became bishop in 698. If he made the book, he probably did so over years, in the hours he could spare. That same 10th century priest, Aldred, did something else remarkable. He wrote a translation into Old English between the lines of the Latin, in small neat script, right across the whole book. It is the earliest surviving translation of the Gospels into any form of English. So the manuscript carries two men's work, separated by 2.5 centuries, sharing the same page. The Scriptorium would have been a plain room, chosen for its light. There was no artificial lighting worth the name. Candles and rushlights are dim, they flicker, and open flame near vellum and pigment is a bad idea, so serious work was done in daylight and only in daylight. That means that in a Northumbrian winter, when the sun comes up late and goes down in the middle of the afternoon, the working day was short. Perhaps 5 or 6 usable hours. And cold. Fingers stiffen. There are later medieval scribes who complained about this in the margins of their own books, little notes saying that the ink is freezing or that their hands ache. The room would have been quiet, though not silent. The scratch of a quill. The sound of someone sharpening one. Wind. Gulls. The sea, always, somewhere underneath everything. And through the day, at intervals, a bell, calling everyone away to the church for the offices, so that the work was constantly interrupted by prayer and then resumed. Nobody was trying to finish quickly. There was no deadline. The book would take as long as the book took. The writing itself was done with a quill, cut from a large feather, usually goose or swan. You cut the nib to a chisel edge and split it up the middle so it holds ink and releases it evenly. A quill goes blunt quickly, so a scribe recut his pen many times a day. In his other hand he held a small knife, both for sharpening and for holding the vellum flat and for scraping away mistakes, which is why medieval scribes are so often shown with a pen in one hand and a blade in the other. The script used in the Gospels is called insular majuscule. It is upright, rounded, and generous. Every letter is drawn rather than written, with a deliberate lift between strokes. It is not fast. You cannot hurry it without it showing. Before writing, the page was ruled, faint lines pricked and scored into the vellum with a hard point, marking out the text block and every line of writing so that the columns stayed true. That preparation alone took real time. Then, line by line, the words went down. The Latin of the 4 Gospels, in a hand so consistent that across 259 surviving leaves it barely changes at all. And then there are the decorated pages, which are the reason people queue to see the book. There are pages given entirely to ornament, known as carpet pages, because they look like woven textiles. There are enormous initial letters at the opening of each Gospel that unfurl across the whole sheet. And the ornament is not simple. It is interlace, ribbons that cross over and under one another in continuous knots, spirals that turn into other spirals, and long thin animals whose bodies have been drawn out into ribbons and knotted together with everything else. If you follow one strand with your eye, it goes and goes and goes. On some pages the background is filled with tiny dots of red pigment, laid down one at a time, thousands upon thousands of them, to make the pale shapes stand out. People have tried to count them. On a single page the count runs into the tens of thousands. There is no shortcut. Somebody sat with a fine pen and made each one. That, more than anything else in the book, tells you what sort of patience we are dealing with. A single decorated page is generally reckoned to represent months of work. Here is a small thing that I think is genuinely lovely. When conservators examined the manuscript closely, they found faint underdrawings beneath the finished decoration, made with a hard grey point that left a mark on the surface. It appears Eadfrith drew out his designs first, lightly, and then worked over them. That is an ordinary thing for an artist to do, except that this may be the earliest known European use of a lead point in this way, a kind of ancestor of the pencil. There is more. Some of the complex patterns are geometrically constructed, built up from compass points and grids, so that the interlace is not freehand invention but carefully plotted design. And on certain pages the pattern on one side corresponds to the pattern on the other, which has led to the suggestion that he worked with the sheet held against the light so he could see through it. Whether or not that particular idea is right, and it is debated, the underlying picture is clear enough. This was not a man doodling piously. This was a designer, working out a very complicated structure in advance, and then executing it slowly, by hand, on skin, in a cold room, by the sea. The colors are worth pausing on. The palette in the Gospels is rich: yellows, greens, pinks, a deep blue, and a good deal of red. For a long time it was said that the blue must be lapis lazuli, ground from stone brought all the way from Afghanistan, and that a book on a North Sea island therefore contained a mineral carried across half the world. It is a wonderful story and it was repeated everywhere. But when the pigments were analyzed in modern laboratories using non-destructive techniques, the lapis was not found. The blues turned out to be plant-based, most likely indigo or woad. The truth is that nearly all the colors in the book could be sourced locally or through ordinary trade: minerals, plants, insects. That is less romantic, and I think more impressive. It means the brilliance of those pages is a matter of skill rather than treasure. The pigments were ground on a stone, mixed with egg white or gum to bind them, and applied in thin layers with a brush that may have been only a few hairs wide. Some of it has faded. A great deal of it has not. The reds and golds still look wet. It is worth saying plainly what the book was for. It was not a private object. It was a gospel book made for the altar, and specifically, it seems, in honor of Saint Cuthbert, a monk and bishop of Lindisfarne who had died in 687 and whose shrine had become the center of the community's life. Books like this were carried in procession, laid on altars, shown to visitors. They were meant to be beautiful in a way that argued for the importance of what was inside them. Very few people who saw it could read the Latin, and that was not really the point. The point was that the object itself declared that these words mattered enough to spend years on. Later the book was fitted with a cover of gold and jewels, which was lost long ago. Later still, when the community left the island and traveled with Cuthbert's coffin, the book went with them, and eventually to Durham, and centuries after that to London. It has survived storms, moves, a dissolution, and the stripping of its binding. The pages themselves came through it all, and the ink is still black. What stays with me is the arithmetic of it. If a single carpet page took months, and there are several, and the plain text pages run to hundreds, then the whole book is not a project of weeks or seasons. It is years of a man's life, taken in short winter afternoons and long summer ones, interrupted 8 times a day by bells, on an island where the weather is rarely kind. He would have known he might not finish. Scribes often did not. There are medieval manuscripts that stop mid-sentence because the person writing them stopped, and someone else took over in a different hand, or nobody did. This one does not stop. It runs all the way through, in one hand, from beginning to end. Somewhere in there is a decision, made every single morning for years, to sit down at the same table and continue. Not to hurry. Not to simplify the pattern. Just to pick up the pen, recut the nib, check the ruling, and add another line to a page that would not be finished for months. That is the whole story, really. Everything else is decoration, in the most literal sense. So we will leave him there, at the table by the window, in the last of the afternoon light, with the tide coming in across the causeway and the island closing itself off from the mainland for a few hours the way it does twice every day. The pen is down. The page is covered against the damp. Tomorrow there will be another few hours of light, and a few more lines, and eventually, in its own time, a finished book. There is no hurry. There never was. Sleep well. Sleepy history, true stories, told slowly.